Growing up in Idaho, love the stories of Idaho's people and its past. Learn some history and get to know a bit more about the good old days, where some folks remember growing up in Idaho. I'm Jeff Hicks, and I'll be your host.
We lived in an old house down on River Street in Salmon, Idaho when I was a kid. And we moved in there when I was in the second grade. And it was just a 3-room house, no inside plumbing except for the kitchen sink. And my dad went to work and put in a couple of more bedrooms and a bathroom in the house and stuff. So it took him a few years to do that. My brother and I, Lonnie, we slept in the same bed, in a little rollaway bed that we push out of the back porch into the kitchen at night when it was cold. And it was just a twin size rollaway, and I was 14 when I finally got my own bed. So we were kind of poor people, had a hard time of it. Dad was sick a lot and couldn't work. But anyway, down on River Street, there is a reason it was called River Street, because it was the last street in town before you got to the river. The river was right behind our house. And the Salmon River is also known as the River of No Return. That's another story which maybe we can tell sometime. But there's a big island in the river right behind our house. And that island was the playground for all of us boys in the neighborhood growing up, and the girls too. We'd go over there and camp out and do stuff all the time on the island. And there was a guy named Wesley Wells he owned the island, and most of it anyway. And he ran a few cows and some milk cows and a couple of horses over there.
Now, Wesley was Juan and Danny Beer's stepdad or something, wasn't he?
He was their grandfather.
Or granddad? Okay.
Yeah, Juan and Danny's mother, Margaret Gaver was her name. She had Juan and Danny and then divorced their dad and married a guy named Carl Gaver. And Carl and their mother went off on their own in another play, and down the river he worked for the Forest Service. Anyway, Wesley Wells, their grandpa, and their grandma, Lindy Wells, took those two boys in when they were just little kids, first or second grade, and raised them to be grown-ups. Did a good job too. They took good care of those boys and worked hard with them, and they both grew up to be good men. And they're good friends of mine even now. If ever I go to Salmon, I always make sure and try to see Juan, especially. He was my age.
Yeah, Juan still lives on River Street, just down from where Wesley.
Yeah, he does, as a matter of fact.
Right there on the corner.
Yeah. And anyway, we grew up along the river. And us boys had a pact, an agreement. And the first day of March every year, we'd go over and jump in the river and go swimming, which was really stupid. The ice was gone out of the river. That river would freeze over in the winter, and except for a few open stretches of water here and there. But for the most part, it was froze across. And the ice would go out sometime mid to late February. So by the 1st of March, the only ice along the river was about 6 feet thick of shore ice on both banks that followed the river down. And that ice didn't go out until, probably sometime in late April.
Yeah.
But the river had built up that ice about 6 feet thick during the winter. And then anyway, we'd all go over and swim in the river. Didn't stay in very long, but long enough to be have bragging rights that we went swimming on the 1st of March again this year. Weren't many kids at Salmon that wanted to do that.
I remember in the mid-'70s, my brother Mike and I did the same thing. And it was the 10th of March, as I recall. We went over to swim because it was the first sunny day, Saturday. And we went over there and had a contest to see who could keep their whole body under the water the longest. And of course, Mike won because he had more padding. He was a fat kid, and he was able to stay under 10 seconds before he passed out, and I had to go in and save him.
Yeah. Well, that was cold water.
Oh yeah,
Running right along with the ice. Why? You're not too smart, but
right.
we were tough. We were
Oh
men,
yeah, yeah.
tough guys. We do that every year, and then all summer long we'd swim in the river, and I have a good friend named Dick Putnam, and when this was after we were grown up and married and had families. Dick lived down in Boise. He moved to Salmon eventually, but at that time he lived in Boise. He came to visit us, and him and his family, and we went walking up the river. Dick and I did, to go fishing, and we fished for a while off the bank and along the river, and it was really brushy. It's that time of year when the brush was really thick, which was all the time, but in late spring it was really thick, and so it was time to go back. We had to get back for dinner, and so we started back, and I did what we always did when we were boys, and that is jump in the river. And the river down along that bank where I went was about, some places about to your neck and other places be over your head.
Yeah.
And I had my fishing pole in one hand and it's kept my clothes on, and because that's what we did growing up as boys. We'd jump in the river whenever we wanted to get down the river in a hurry. We had about 2 or 3 miles to go, and it was a lot of trouble walking down through the brush and fighting and bending. And so I just jumped in the river and let the river take me down the river. And I jumped in and I hollered at Dick and said, "Hey, Dick, come on, get in. The river will take you." And he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "Yeah, jump in. I'm walking on the bottom." So you just could walk along with the current, and it'd carry you along down the river. And when you come to a place that was over your head, you'd just tread water until you could get your feet on, until it shallowed out a little bit. But that was that stretch of river that I swam in, Lonnie and I and the Beers boys and the Moore boys and several other guys swam in that river our whole life. So we knew the river well and knew where it was going to be too swift and too deep. And that was a fun thing to float down the river like that. And that's where I learned to swim, was in the Salmon River. And I was 8 years old. The summer I was 8 years old. My sister Carla and my sister Sherry, who were older than me, taught Lonnie and I how to swim. And I swam across the Salmon River when I was almost 9 years old. And then I rested a while and got back in it and swam back across. And for a kid that age, that was kind of a foolish thing to do, but we did it all the time after that. Never thought anything about it. There was a set of rapids, and the rapids where they'd splash up and down. They were 5 or 6 foot rapids. And we'd swim out in the river above the rapids, and then just no tube or anything, just kind of tread water and let the river take us through the rapids. And you'd come up and catch your breath, and sometimes you'd be under the water, but you'd pop back up. Good times.
Yeah.
Lots of good memories about the Salmon River. The river also claimed 2 or 3 lives every year. I had a couple of friends that drowned in the Salmon River when we were teenagers growing up. And nowadays it's a big boating river, whitewater river, and boaters from all over everywhere come there and run that river. And they sometimes they get there too early, and they come in early part of June when the river's about 3 times its normal size because of the high water runoff from the snow upstream. And that's when they wreck and drown, 2 or 3 of them. Always 1 or 2 every year drowns in the Salmon River just because they don't use good judgment.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. And cold water will take your strength away. You get crampy.
Yeah. Or people that don't understand swimming in a swift river, they'll try to fight the current until it wears them out and they have no strength left. Yeah. And if you've got any brains, you won't fight the current. You'll just let it take you along. You'll gradually work your way to the bank. Might take a mile or so to fight and go, going down the river, but you'll finally get to the bank if you don't panic and just keep on working over that direction. So,
yeah, I think one of the weirdest feelings that I've ever had swimming in the river is when you get into those eddies and, those, you get a back eddy or you get an eddy around a rock or whatever. And you feel it pulling you down. It's kind of a scary thought. If you just let your body go and not fight it, you'll go out the bottom.
Yeah.
But a lot of times people fight and lose their strength, and then it's sometimes they get in trouble.
They get panicky, and then it'll just roll you around under a great big rock until you drown. Yeah. Unless you're smart enough to just let it, like you said, let the current take you. And when you get close to the edge of the current, then do a couple of kicks and a couple of swift strokes, and you'll pull out of it.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of keeping your head and knowing what to do and doing it,
And looking for the signs. I mean, it's best not to get in around those eddies.
No, you stay away from there to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you the story about a friend of mine named Larry Lee? He was from Chalice. He about drowned. I pulled him out one time. Did I ever tell you that story?
No, let's hear it.
Well, my cousin Vic Mann, and Larry Lee and I decided we'd float the Salmon River over behind our house on River Street. And I'd done it a million times. And as you go into those rapids, you got to stay in the swift water where the water is swift. If you get one side or the other, those big rapids have big eddies along the side of them, and especially down at the bottom end of them. You get in an eddy and you just got to go with it until you can finally work your way back out. But like I said, Vic we were all in inner tubes this time, and Vic went through first, and Larry Lee was in the middle, and I was in the back. And Larry, we were kids about 16 years old, 17. Actually, I just got married. I forgot. So I was about 19. Been married a couple of weeks. And I was in the back, and I was coming into the rapids, and Vic was over on the bank yelling just as loud as he could yell, so I could hear him over the sound of the rushing water, saying, "Get Larry, get Larry." And I looked around for him, and Larry had got himself in one of those eddies, and he'd fallen off his inner tube, and it was floating off down the river. And Larry didn't know how to swim. We didn't know that, or we would never have gone there. You don't get in any big body of water, especially a swift one, if you can't swim.
Right.
And he wanted to go and have fun with us, so he didn't tell us that he couldn't swim. He was splashing and kicking around and going through round and around this eddy. And I was still upstream a little ways. And I saw he was in a lot of trouble. So I rolled off my tube and swam over there and deliberately went into the eddy. And he disappeared, but I saw about where I thought he'd gone under. So I swam as swift as I could over to that spot. The water's moving, so it's hard to keep track. Anyway, all of a sudden, his hand came up in front of my face, just right out like a foot in front of me. And I grabbed him by the wrist. And of course, he was panicky. He was drowning. He immediately climbed up on me and wrapped himself all around my arms and shoulders and head and everything else. And funny thing, I couldn't do a thing. I was all tied up because he was in such a panic. And we started sinking. And I remember thinking, well, it's too bad. I've only been married for a couple of weeks. Bertie's going to be a widow. Well, it didn't happen that way. That eddy, where we used to jump in it on purpose and let it take us around, and it was about 20 feet deep there. And the bottom of that thing, because of the big cliffs there on the bank, over the hundreds of years, the rocks had fallen in there. And the bottom of that big eddy had big boulders, big rocks. And but funny thing, we went down and my feet hit the bottom, and it was a sandy bottom. And I still had my equilibrium well enough to remember where the bank was. And with him clinging to me as tight as he could hold, I had no use of my arms, but I was able to balance on my feet and walk out of the river and up onto the bank, just like walking on a sidewalk.
Wow.
Just like walking on a dry sidewalk. And I guarantee you, the Lord saved our lives, because we should have drowned, because there was no sandy bottom in that eddy. it was all boulders and rocks. And the Lord put the bottom under my feet, and we walked right out of there. So
That's
I've
pretty
always
amazing.
been grateful for that. Thought about it a lot over the years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we got out. That was a.
One of the things that you taught Mike and me when we were kids was to not mess around the river, because in the wintertime, when it froze over and we got big ice chunks, maybe you could talk a little bit about any experiences you might have had in those days when you were a kid with, messing around the river in the wintertime.
Okay. Well, we'd go over there, but for the first, all the way through November and into most of December, there'd be big ice floes floating down the river, big chunks of ice, big flat pieces. So you stayed out of there.
Yeah.
I knew a kid, an old friend of mine named Tommy Gibbs, and I don't know what was the matter with him. He used to jump from one ice floe to another and cross the river on them.
Wow.
But I never had either. I was either too smart or something. I never tried that trick.
It's probably good you didn't.
Fallen in, you were a goner.
Yeah.
The ice floes would float over top you, and you might get caught between them and crush your skull or something.
Yeah.
We're talking several tons of ice. Anyway, by about Christmas time, the river back behind our place, except where those rapids were, the river would be froze over. And I remember one day, it was, I think it was New Year's Day. Lonnie and I, my brother Lonnie, we decided to go fishing. Or he was going fishing and I was going duck hunting. So I had my gun and Lonnie took his fishing pole and we walked over the river, and we'd had a thermometer, a big thermometer on the back side of the house. And as we went out the back door, I looked at it and it was 15 below zero. So it's cold. Anyway, we went over to the river, and there's a dike along the river because in the spring when the water was really high, they needed that dike to keep it from going out in the farmers' fields there and washing their topsoil away. And Lonnie went up on the dike and said, "I'm going to fish right here." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to walk on up the dike a ways and then come down the slough," which was about half a mile from the dike over inland a ways, kind of circled around. And when I get through hunting, I'm going to go on home because I'm freezing to death. He said, "Okay, I'll be there after a while." Well, I went ahead and did my hunting stuff and never got anything. It was too cold. And so I was on my way home, and I walked past the spot where I'd left Lonnie. I couldn't see him because the dike was in the way. And it was about maybe a half mile or so from where I was over to the river anyway. And I was freezing. And I said to myself, well, I'm going to go home. Lonnie will be home pretty soon. And something said, no, go check on Lonnie and see if he's caught any fish. Something inside my brain told me that. And I said, no, I'm going home. And I was arguing with myself.
Yeah.
And finally, the impression to go check on Lonnie got so strong that I said, well, all right. So I'll see if he caught any fish. So I had to walk across there. I was walking in about 18 inches of snow, breaking the crust on it to get over there. I got over there and I walked up on the dike, and there Lonnie stood in this big place on the river where it was froze over. And he had chopped a hole in the ice, but he'd also broke through the ice, and he was standing in the river with his arms outstretched, balancing on either side of him on the hole that he'd made when he fell through. And I knew that river right there in that spot, because I'd swam in it my whole life, was way over his head. And I went over running down off the bank, and I said, what happened? What happened? He said, I'm standing on a sapling. A sapling is a little green tree that the roots would washed out, and it fell down, and it was underneath the ice, and it was in the water down under the ice, and he was standing on it. And he said, you got to get me out of here. My feet are going to slip off pretty soon. And he was in that water for a little while, getting colder and colder and colder. And there was some dry willows there, and I broke a big old willow branch off and crawled out on the ice. And stuck it out to him, and he got hold of it. And I pulled him out of there and pulled him over on the where it was thick enough that he could get up, and he took off running for home, which was about a mile and a half. And I went ahead and took the big willow that I had and pulled his fishing pole over to me and the axe that he was using, so we didn't lose those. Then I got up and headed for home, and I was following his tracks in the snow because I knew it was 15 below zero, and he was all wet clear up over his head, you know.
Yeah.
But he made it home. And I got there a few minutes later, and he was in the house, and he'd taken all his clothes off, and we had a wood stove, and he was huddled up by the wood stove with a blanket around him, thawing out. But the point about that whole thing, two things. First one is something told me to go check on Lonnie, go see if he caught any fish. It never occurred to me he broke through the ice. So I headed over there, and it took me, because the thick, deep snow and breaking trail through the snow, at least 15 minutes to get over there.
Yeah.
Well, he'd only been standing in the river for maybe 5 minutes. So the Spirit, the Lord, whatever you can call it, you call it what you want, told me to go check on Lonnie before he ever broke through the ice.
Yeah.
And I got there in time to save him, because pretty soon he'd have got so cold he'd have lost his balance on that sapling and washed under. And it was about 100 yards of ice below him that he'd been under. And then it broke open to those rapids that I've told you about. So if he'd ever made it that far, he would have went through the rapids. He'd have been drowned by then.
Yeah.
And we'd have lost Lonnie. He'd have been gone.
Yeah. You'd have probably never found him.
Probably never would have. I know of 2 or 3 instances where people fell in the river and they never have found them.
Yeah.
To this day, they haven't found them. They disappear.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, another exciting, scary story. And Lonnie lived to be an old man. He just died about 6 weeks ago.
Yep.
So,
you know, as a kid growing up, Mike and I had similar stories. We never broke through the ice, but, you know, we played around there all the time, winter and summer.
Yeah.
Swam in the river and messed around, floated the river. We never had, you know, I think about floating the river. When I was a kid, we didn't own a life jacket. It never occurred to us that we needed to wear one.
No.
And, you know, but when you're a little kid growing up around those types of areas, you learn the danger zones, and you learn how to swim.
Yeah.
And you just try not to get killed.
Yeah. Well, as I recall, Mom and I taught you kids how to swim in Panther Creek, and made sure you knew how to swim, and taught you about that river and how to, if you ever fall in, just go with the current. And eventually you'll work your way out. Don't panic. No reason to panic. As long as your head's above water, you're okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We still body surf. There's a stretch of river there behind the Simmons Ranch.
Yeah.
Where we go up every year, and I taught all the kids how to do that, and it's just a lot of fun. We have a good time. But you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the big point right there, is don't get in that river if you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
And there are people who do it every year. These boaters that come from New Jersey or somewhere come out here to float the main famous river of no return. First thing you know, 1 or 2 of them get drowned because they do something that they don't know how to do, and they stick their neck out too far, and it end up getting caught in an eddy, or caught under a rock, or caught under a pile of brush.
Well, you know, even one of the greatest kayakers in the world lost his life in a river, not because he didn't know what he was doing, but because he got snagged up on a fallen log or something.
Yeah.
And so,
well, that was Doc Blackador, and it was the Payette River over on the eastern side of the state. And he had one of those flexible kayaks that were soft kayaks. They were popular for a while. Maybe they still are. I don't know. But there was one of those logs. You've seen them. The current would make them bounce up and down. They're right on the surface.
Yep.
And he got too close to one of those, and while it was up, nose of his kayak went under it, and the current caught it and pulled it down and folded the kayak over him like an envelope with him in it and under the water. There's not a thing he could do, too much pressure from the current for him to push out. And that's where they found him.
That's horrible.
Yeah,
there's a lot of power in water. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, Dad, I've been doing a little thinking about Dugout Dick lately. I don't know why. He just came to my mind the other day, and was thinking about talking to him when I was a kid. And, he was an interesting guy. Showed up in Idaho, I don't know, around 1950, I suppose, 48, I think. But he, as you know, walked out by Ellis there, somewhere around Elk Bend, and built some caves in that slide rock out there.
Yeah.
Did you know him very well? I know we've talked about him once or twice.
Yeah.
Did you ever visited with him much?
I did know Dugout Dick. When I used to drive school bus up the Salmon River, and I had the Salmon River run up the river, and I'd go up there about, I think it was 28 miles.
Yeah.
Morning and night, pick up kids and deliver kids home. And Dick it was against the school policy, but I'd do it anyway. Dick used to catch a ride on the school bus into town, and then at the end of the day, he knew where I'd be, and he'd catch a ride back.
It's nice.
Up to his place in the school bus with me. And he never talked much. He didn't do much talking. He was pretty quiet. But he'd get in the bus and thank me, and very polite and courteous. Kind of a grubby looking guy. He never had long hair down to his shoulders and a big beard.
Yep.
Scary looking guy, in fact, but very polite and courteous, and had good vocabulary. He could speak well. Must have been pretty well educated. I don't know about that. But you're right. He became a hermit, and he went up there and built stacked the rocks and dug tunnels back into the slide rock. And that's where he lived, and was in those tunnels inside the rock.
Yeah.
There's one place there where he figured out that if he could get the air currents going, there was a spring-fed spring there running down through those rocks. He pulled them out and rearranged them and everything, and he built himself an ice box. A walk-in cooler is what it was. And the air currents, even in the summer when it's hot, they'd go in there and somehow the currents would cool off enough to keep it froze. And you could go in I went in at one time. You could go in his cooler, he called it his cooler. And it was cold in there to keep the deer that he poached fresh and everything, and whatever else he had in there to keep it like a big old walk-in refrigerator.
I've talked to Dick a few times. I'd see him in town and say hello to him, and occasionally he would stop and have something to say. But when I lived in Salmon as a kid, it never occurred to me that I ought to pick his brain and just find out all he knows, because I'm sure he knows a lot. People like that usually do.
Yeah.
And just find out what he knows and how he survived and what he does to take care of himself.
Yeah.
Living off the grid does take some talent. Not everybody can do it. And it's kind of a learn as you go thing. And first of all, you have to have enough guts to do it. And then from there, it's a matter of learning and not making the same mistake twice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, his name was Richard Zimmerman.
Yeah.
But of course they called him Dick. And then he became Dugout Dick because the dugout, part of his name, came from rearranging those rocks in that slide rock hill for his cabin.
Yeah.
It wasn't made of wood, it was made of rocks. And he lived in there. It was dugout,
Mm-hmm.
Dig a hole in the hill, dugout. And that's where he lived for, I don't know how many years he was there. He was there after I grew up and we moved away from Salmon, and he was still there, but he died sometime after that. I don't know when.
2010, I think, or around there. He was pretty old, in his 90s, early 90s, I think.
Okay.
I read an account Fitties lived across the river from him,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and they on holidays once in a while would have him over to feed him, and it's my understanding they had a deal where he'd come over some Sundays and bathe and have Sunday dinner with them, and then go back
Yeah.
home. Nice people.
Yeah. Mr. and Mrs. Fitti were good people, and their boys were good boys. The one kid got himself in a lot of trouble later on, and when he was, high school kid, but
Yeah.
that's another story. But anyway, yeah, they rode my school bus, the Fitti boys. I liked them. They were good kids, very polite, but roughneck kids too,
Oh
growing
yeah.
up along the Salmon River. Grew up the same way you did, right along the river.
Yep. So when you were a kid, 12 or 13 years old, you worked in Cobalt in the summers and then on the weekends during school. Maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about your experiences getting to Cobalt and what you did, and maybe a few people you knew who lived out at Cobalt in those days.
Okay. Well, yeah, I started working out there when I was 12. Actually, I was 11. I turned 12 just in August, and I started working there. I think it was mid-June when I was 11. And the reason I worked there, I worked in the gas station. My brother-in-law was married to my sister Carla. His name was Carol Jarvis. He ran the gas station. They hired me to be a gas pump guy, and so I learned a lot about cars and stuff from that. Most of my life, I've done my own work on my cars and done all that because of those days. But Cobalt in those days, I think they had about 1,000 miners, underground miners, and then another 1,000 or more mill workers and support staff and various things. So the little town of what they mined was cobalt, and they built a little town and named it Cobalt, and that's where the gas station was, where I worked. And there was about 3,000 people that lived there. It was about the size of Salmon, only it was more compact. It was in a little narrow canyon, and they had mine housing. Anyway, compact but stuff. But yeah, I was there from that time, and then in the summers I'd go out all summer, and then during the winter I'd drive over and back and forth over the mountain and work there on Saturdays and Sundays and go over Friday night. I usually skip out of school the last period or two of the day so I could get on the mountain before it got dark. And I had a 1951 Ford, and of course we had snow tires, and the snow tires, they don't make them anymore. In those days, they'd put sawdust in the tread, and they'd grip the ice really well. And you couldn't go over those mountains unless you put chains on regular tires. They just wouldn't do it. It's too slick.
Yeah.
But I'd drive over and then back on Sunday, and usually have 2 or 3 kids who lived out there, stayed in town all week to go to school, and then they'd ride out back and forth with me. And that's how the kids were. And so, when I was 13, 14, 15 years old, I'd drive over that mountain in the wintertime. Snow would be about 10 feet deep up on the top of the summit. And down in the bottoms, it would be on the Cobalt side, it would be 2 or 3 feet of snow, because that's still pretty high elevation back in there. On the Salmon side, sometimes it'd only be a little skiff of snow. But I learned how to drive on slick roads. I ran off the road 3 times before I learned how to slow down and not go around those turns too fast.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a big deal. I'd time it because I knew my dad was working up there. Dad ran the snowplow on that road all winter long in those years, and I knew he'd be coming along in his snowplow pretty soon. He could pull me back.
Yeah.
I just remember just as clear as if it happened 5 minutes ago. He'd pull me back up on the road and would clean the snow out of around my radiator and under the front end so I could steer the car and stuff. And then he'd say, "Slow her down, boy." And he'd get in his snowplow and head off down the road, and I'd head on out to Cobalt. And like I said, that first winter that I did that, I ran off the road 3 times. And when you go off the road, if the snow's deep enough, it's not a big deal. because your car just plows out into the snow and stops. But if there's not enough snow, why then you hit rocks and trees and brush and everything else.
Right.
But Dad always put a big berm of snow, a windrow of snow along the outside shoulders or wherever there's a ditch or something. So, because people are running off the road all the time.
Yeah.
Those miners would get drunk and come back over the mountain drunk in a hurry to get so they could make shift. And they'd run off the road. Well, that big berm of snow would stop them from going down over the bank 1,000 feet down into the bottom of the canyon.
Yeah.
It was not a road you should go very fast on.
Yeah. You know, when I was 14 or 15, I was up there camping one winter because, you know, the beds were too cozy, I guess. You know how kids are.
Yeah.
Go out and camp in the middle of the winter for some strange reason. Anyway, I just thought how fun it would be to see how fast I could get down those switchbacks on the Williams Creek side. And of course, I had chains on my little pickup, but I had Brett Jorgensen with me, and I don't think Brett thought I was very smart for doing that because I was coming around those switchbacks just as fast as that pickup would go and on ice, you know.
Yeah.
And it's just a good thing we didn't go over the side. But, you know, whoever had plowed had left, just like you were saying, left a bank there so that we wouldn't have gotten killed, probably.
Yeah, those were good times. But let me talk a little bit about the miners.
Okay.
Miners are an interesting breed. I don't even know who to compare them to. Now, there were family men. A lot of them had families and children and stuff, and they were pretty good guys. But there were a lot of single men that were miners, and they lived in the miners' dormitories. And those guys get drunk, and a lot of them be drunk most of the time, except when they were going underground. It's against the federal law to be drunk when you're underground mining. And if you get caught doing it, you go to prison for it. Anyway, it's another story. But those miners would go in on Friday and Saturday night to the recreation hall where there's a beer hall there and dance hall and stuff. They'd get drunk and all along about midnight or a little before, they were drunk enough that they'd start fighting with each other. And so I grew up up through my teenage years watching grown men slug it out. And it was pretty good entertainment. Watch those guys fight. And some of them were really good at it.
Yeah.
And some of them were not so good, but the ones that were not so good always lost.
Right.
The good fighters always won. But
yeah,
it was interesting to watch them. And so therefore, later in life, when I became a police officer, I'd had those experiences watching what drunk men will do, minors or not. When you get drunk, it changes your whole outlook on everything. And so that served me well, understanding that these guys can be dangerous.
Yeah.
You got to watch them, you know. And those miners would do that, and then the next day they'd be sober and they hunt each other up and apologize and shake hands and hug each other. And, you know, it was all about just having a good time, and fighting was part of their good time, I guess.
Now, Grandpa Harry Hicks, your dad, claims, and he wrote it in his life history, he claims that he was the first miner in Blackbird Mine. What do you think about that claim?
That is the truth. They were just opening up Blackbird Mine when my dad was a miner, an underground miner up in a place called Patterson, and they had some mines up there called the Ima mines. I think they mined copper and zinc and stuff. Anyway, they opened cobalt, and so there were some opportunities over there. Well, Dad heard about it, and we were tired of living up by Patterson, up way from everywhere. So Dad got in the car, and he drove over to Cobalt, and it wasn't Cobalt. They didn't have a town there. It was just Blackbird Mine. He drove over there, and they hired him, and he was the first real miner, underground miner that they ever hired at the Blackbird Mine, which later on the little town was called Cobalt. They hired other miners right away after that, but he was the first one that went on the payroll, and his job title was hard rock miner.
Thanks for listening. growing up in Idaho, the good old days.